so much, Adele. I particularly appreciate that in terms of your own very fine scholarship. And I bring greetings from Michelangelo, my co-author. He couldn't be here because he's been made acting dean at the School of Architecture at IIT in Chicago, but he sends his greetings. And yes, thank you so much for coming out. I thought what I would do with you tonight is not give you a potted history of the book, but sort of introduce some themes that might also encourage feedback and interest from all of you who've so kindly come. So there will be some things that run all the way through, one of which will be the differences between modernity, or the different phases of modernity, the idea of the modern, and the modernist movement. And we're in a space here which I think gives us a very good idea of the specific nature of modernism and its different forms, because there were many. The sense, for example, of designing in terms of space. The sense, too, of the clarity of form. The use of new materials. The idea that architecture was about artifacts and about an understanding of artistic, creative design, as well as functionalism. The sense that you designed for the present through an analysis of the design problem, but you designed in terms of a much larger temporal order. So those three things will come through. The other thing that will come through are ideas around the nation, around nature and the new. And I'd just like to point out, as we start here, in one of many buildings that's been demolished, the grain elevator at Ogden, just outside Calgary, and I'll come back to the importance of this, to say, of course, that one of the things we tried to do in this book was to really come to grips with the huge changes that we've got. I mean, after all, where we begin, roughly the opening of the CPR railway in 1886-87, Canada was the senior dominion in a global empire. It's now surviving in the huge volatility, economic, political, and otherwise, of the so-called globalized world. I mean, a huge difference that we had to come to grips with. We have some other changes which I think are fascinating. The fact that at the beginning of the book, really the First Nations were not part of the understanding of what Canada was. There was still the rhetoric which Stephen Leacock used, that essentially Canada was a wilderness that was brought to life by people like us, settler peoples. Well, that is no longer true, quite rightly, and it's interesting to say that the advisory committees on the reconstruction of Canada, which were heavily influenced, particularly the Committee 4 report, by much modernist rhetoric. That report was about housing and community planning, and some of the research that was done for that recognized the importance of First Nations craft and art. Interesting. Then the other thing we might think of course, is the huge change in the role of women. There were very few women architects even into the 1930s. But now, of course, women architects and designers and planners are of great significance. And I could name some other things, including the fact that in about the middle of the book, which deals very much with reconstruction policy and thinking, and the way literally Canada was reconstructed after the First World War and the Depression and the crash and so on, and the Second World War, we need to remember that in 1947 was the year that we became Canadians. Up until that time, you had been British. Anyway, I don't want to go too much into details, but let's start with this, because this reminds us of the fact that Canada is often a forgotten partner in the beginning of the understanding of a new imagery, a new ideology of architecture. It was very much wrapped around the grain silo. But before I get into that, I should say that the book that Michelangelo and I wrote was one of a series. We were not altogether happy with the fact it was very much nation fixed. But on the other hand, of course, in many of these stories, the presence of national politics and ideas and dynamics was actually very important, including in terms of the uses, very different, of modernism in these countries. Can I tell you that originally Canada was going to be dealt with as an epilogue in the book on the USA? Need I say more? And completely forgetting, of course, the importance of, particularly for Corbusier and Walter Gropius, the huge importance of the silo, which were usually seen as American, as in US or South American. But in fact, if you look at the literature, a lot of them were in Canada. And I think we sort of forget that sense that Canada contributed to that new understanding of design, design which came out of technology and use and necessity as much as, if you like, high cultural values. So a couple of sheets which I think are very interesting. And it's sort of stuck in a slightly strange way. And I say I'm not just going to concentrate on the story of the book, but just throw some things at you. This is Emile Brunei, who in the 37 Expo at Paris expressed Canada in terms of a mini grain silo. So we get that sort of very interesting way in which things stick. Of course, we can't really discount the idea of nation because so much of the history of the modern period, if you take it back to the Renaissance or sort of the end of the medieval era, was about fighting for resources. Much of the settler history of Canada, as you all know as well as I do, was about, for example, the Northwest Passage, to get the good stuff in the Ayrshires. It was about the fur trade, it was about wood, it was about gold. And of course that led to a series of colonial wars, particularly between the British and the French. And here is Voltaire giving a quite nice view of that. A lot of the history of Canada too revolves, and we begin with the Canadian Pacific Railway, around this idea of conquering nature. The very term dominion is interesting, isn't it? Straight out of the Bible, this idea that your duty is to control and change and exploit, often in a more positive than negative way, perhaps. This is Cornelius Krieghoff, and you get the sense, of course, my reference to nature, of how important the natural environment has been into the making of Canada. And we all know, particularly through various forms of art, which sort of give us a sense too of the importance of visual art in setting some of the thinking of what we call the modern movements. This is Lauren Harris, one of his paintings of the North. We get that sense, don't we, which was carried out in a number of cultural theorists in Canada, that what has driven Canada has been its sort of sublime vastness, the wilderness idea. But of course, too, if nation is important presence, it also is defeated by that self-same geography. I mean, this is a lovely shot near Osoyoos, where are you in Canada or are you in the United States? And I think, of course, it's worth remembering, and we tried not to get into, as it were, being parochial in terms of the definition of Canadian design. If you look at a map of North America, I mean, you see, don't you, of course, all sorts of shared geography. What we also see, because the black parts of the wilderness, is how little wilderness there increasingly is, and how much of Canadian history has revolved around city settlement, particularly now. I love this. I'll let you read it. I don't think it's any point in PowerPoints in reading what you can see on the screen. It's true. And we're sort of aware of this. I mean, look at that fabulous photograph, a Notman photograph of the building of the CP rail, and the sense really of conquering nature through technology, through transportation, and through communication. And we try to look at the history of architecture as really a cultural process in the biggest sense of that word. We tend to use culture around more the kind of beautiful objects that surround us here and the sort of art gallery theater approach. But of course its meaning is much deeper than that. It's about sustaining community, which means the economy, which means the technology of the day, and we tried to come to grips with that. And even, of course, to think about technologies that have to do with what was it, Thorsten Veblen talked about, the sort of the consumer middle-class culture. Here we are in Banff, taking us back, of course, to my theme of modernity, because for many people who sort of believed in the modern into the 1920s and 30s, the way that you expressed the modern was through a reference, particularly in architecture, to historical models and imagery. That's one thing, I think, that the modern movement really fought against, the idea of stylism and the idea of imitation. They weren't against understanding history, but understanding history in terms of its processes of design. So here are the leisured classes consuming that wild nature from the Banff Spring hotel. And of course here we do come up against a constant theme that we tried to address, again not wishing to be too over-parochial about what was Canadian, but allowing it to be, so to speak, rather than over-defining it. I mean, the original architect of this hotel was, in fact, from the United States, where that baronial chateau style began, coming from Europe in relation to the railway system itself. And of course, we wanted to sort of play around a little bit with this idea of nation. Look at this marvelous sense and a kind of expression of nation that we might not quite see in the same way, you know, with the Governor General's Guard and so on, and the House of Parliament. But we also tried to realize that architecture has always been very much at the sharp end of economy, for good and for bad, and been associated, of course, with what drove a lot of the development of Canada, the development of various forms of resources. Here, of course, good old spirits, and we're dealing with Seagrams. But it's interesting to see that overlap and not to dismiss it as sort of entirely trivial in your understanding of what it meant visually for people to be part of Canada, and the importance in that sort of visual theatre of the mind of architecture. And of course, one of the people that we dealt with was Bronfman from the Seagram family, and Phyllis Lambert, his daughter. A lovely photograph of, you'll know it, Philip Johnson, Mies van der Rohe, and Phyllis Lambert. Thinking about, I suppose, the design in this case of perhaps the most iconic building of modernism in North America, the Seagram building in New York. Interesting because it tells us about how the modern movement, which was very much driven around social reform and the re-engineering of society, got caught up in the great wheel of commerce, particularly as it became the predominant, what should we say, mode of expression in terms of design in the 50s. Funnily enough, there is the beginning of what we call questioning modernism. We step aside from postmodernism in some of the critical writing about the Seagram building. But they also did a number of buildings. The biggest Mies in North America, as Philip Johnson said, is the TD Tower in Toronto. And my dear friend Michelangelo actually opened a bank account there because he loved the space so much. But this is interesting. It has, too, a sense of a couple of other things we tried to deal with, what I would call auto-modernism, you know, the love affair between many architects and designers and even planners for the automobile as an expression of a new kind of democratic freedom for the individual. It didn't always work quite that way, but also the importance of photography in bringing people into an understanding of modernism and appreciation for it. This is one of those panda photographs, and it's very beguiling, isn't it? I've got a couple more. But also we tried to account for the fact that much of the building did involve change, the sort of what was it, Weber's idea of the iron cage of progress and of modernity, the fact that there's a chimera to all this. We're up in Kitimat, which was designed by Meyer and Wittersley to begin with, and then taken over by Clarence Stein. And really, it's very much an expression of this idea of the potential for a new kind of marriage between the technological, between manufacturing and creating better kind of social conditions. Didn't quite work out that way, but this was very much one of those kind of ideal free towns. And of course we come up against, don't we, so often, the fact that our belief in some new form is going to be some kind of a benign change. I mean, asbestos was, as it says there, the magic mineral. And it has an interesting architectural side beyond all its use in buildings. The date should be 1938, the Modern Architectural Research Group exhibition in London, which was very significant. It was opened by the great Le Corbusier, who came over because his greatest friend was Wells Coates, a Canadian, who had a huge influence on product design in Britain and in Europe, and also was working in low-cost housing, his sun-spun houses. Fascinating person. He actually died on Third Beach, and he did do some work here in Vancouver. But this was a very significant exhibition. Other Canadians took a part in it, and it's sort of the story of Canada, very significant contributions that aren't particularly well known. John Bland worked there. Fred Lestaire did some work there. And guess who did the design for the garden and changed landscape gardening hugely? Christopher Tunnard from Victoria. But I mustn't go on. Please don't let me go on beyond my time. Of course, the other thing that we have to get to grips with, and you can see from this chart, I mean, the huge change in North America, particularly in Canada, from the rural to the urban. And a couple of shots, Montreal over the Golden Square Mile, when it was very much the capital of Canada in every sense, and then a later image, and of course we all know about that huge build-out here in Vancouver. That's an interesting shot. Within the middle sort of part there, of course, one of the great schemes that never happened, the rebuilding of Strathcona, the Leonard Marsh report, the idea that architecture could get rid of blighted social conditions. We still do have McLean Park, which is one of the, I think, quite successful developments that were brought to being by what was originally Central Housing and Mortgage Corporation that later became Canada, CMHC, Canada Mortgage Housing, who did marvelous work. You know, they funded the accommodation for students in universities. They funded planning development. They funded programs to bring in architects from South America, all sorts of things. Alas, of course, they have been turned very much more into a financial institution and less into leaders of essentially the push within modernism for decent housing. And of course, too, there are other forms of nation building where architecture played an important part. The whole kind of virtual community that we associate with the media. This is the CBC. That building has gone, unfortunately, but like many buildings of that sort of deco to modern, had some very interesting murals and decorations on it, but it's been pulled down. But the CBC, in a sense, created a stronger sense of national presence than the rail network could ever do. This is one of the last of the railway stations, the one that the Parkin Associates did in Ottawa. And again, I think it's a fabulous bit of architecture, a lovely expression of the way structure can create its aesthetic, but that aesthetic is also coming from the way the photographer has chosen to express it. I say at the very heart of the book is thinking about reconstruction and trying to sort of realize what the mindset of the day was, the time of meaning of the day. And I think these images around that other new system that took the infrastructure across Canada, the Trans-Canada Highway, what it came out of. This is an advert from the RAIC journal, the Royal Architectural Institute journal, from 1943. And the better future is freeways. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? And of course, too, all through the book, you're having what we were trying to deal with, the emergence of very new kind of social spaces. the shopping mall, the Ericsson link to Yorkdale Shopping Centre from Toronto. The fact too that I think architecture necessarily does have to embrace building for commerce as well as sort of, as it were, high forms of architecture. The other thing which is very interesting in Canada, it's not exclusive to Canada, which is very significant, is the whole realization of the allied arts. To this day, the Canadian Architectural Institute has awards for the allied arts. That recognition of the importance of the visual creative tradition of furniture and design. Here we are in one of those other features of the binding together of the country, where it actually in Gander in Newfoundland, but people forget that there was a very significant push in the 50s to build airports all the way across Canada. Some of them actually rather fine in terms of their design. Here's an interesting shot of Parkin Associates with John C. on the left there, and their design for the Toronto airport, which has now of course been demolished, but in its time was a very interesting solution. Notice what is at the center of the structure, the parking. Everything comes from the car, as it were. But I mean, talk about Fordism or Taylorism, it's terrific, isn't it? But a very different view of the architect. The other thing we tried to really understand better too was the sense of the international presence of Canadian architecture and the importance of international architects coming here and doing work. The most famous of which was, of course, the Toronto City Hall competition from 56, the beginning of the competition, to 58, won by Wiljo Ravel, working with the Parkins. But this was, I remember being back in Britain, how significant this was. This was hugely publicized worldwide. This is a lovely shot too, because I actually was walking along the street with Ned Pratt. I'm not name dropping here, but it was for doing that New Spirit, and Moishi Safdie. And Ned Pratt has said, oh, you know, of course, architecture is demolition. There it is, as you can see. And then the other hugely important building, which still, I think, has huge clout worldwide because it really realized the whole spirit of the modern movement. Prefabrication, that technology could work to make accessible housing, but it didn't have to be dull. It could have real sculptural quality. Of course, Moishi Safdie's habitat for Expo 67. And I was saying, I think, to my son here that of course, it's very interesting, isn't it? The 100th anniversary of this country, architecture played a hugely significant part. The 150th? Not much, alas, which is, I think, very sad for all sorts of reasons. And we forget how many influential Canadians there were. Here's Alvin Boyarsky, who headed the AA for, 19 years, I think, from 71 to 90, had a huge influence with his unit group approach to architecture. And again, I don't want to be a boring person, but just to remind you the significance of immigration. Yes, you know, the myth of Canada is the two founding nations. Well, from the beginning, there was always the Aboriginal peoples, the Indigenous peoples, but many people from the early history of Canada who did not come from France or from Britain, and this process has continued. Here's Pier 21 in Halifax, and just reminding us of the importance of that constant renewal of the country, proved by ARCOP, a very interesting group of architects who included people from Canada like Hayes and Size on the left, Democulus, I can never say his name properly, in the middle here, people from Poland, and so on, who created, I think, a very interesting architectural tradition. And then we also sort of brought in the importance of media. Lovely photograph of Barry Downs with his children in Western Homes and Living. The emergence of the Canadian architect, which is still going, thank goodness. And also, we wanted to try and sort of find a balance between, as it were, the big names and the big things, and the broader picture. So yes, we included the Parkin House and the Ericsson House, but we also at least mentioned, although we didn't show this shot, this is by Stuart Rogers, trained as an architect, got into the lumber business, did a whole series of really lovely houses in Regina. And I mean, I think that's an important point to make, even here in the West Coast, where it seems that modernism has a particular focus, that there is a great deal of really good work going on across the country. Sort of remind you that the flag in some ways is by George Stanley, a lovely piece of modern design. It's beautifully simple and powerful. And of course we do have our sort of iconic figures. Here's Arthur Erickson with a very interesting building, because it did reinvent the way we think about the museum, with his sidekick is Sharon Stone, the sort of the fame side with all the problems that we've got with the Starchitect coming out of that, compared again with the parking office, which looks as though we could be in Detroit designing the next Ford. I must go back there too. The fact in Canada, of course, we do have this very interesting figure, Phyllis Lambert, who created the CCA, which has been a marvelously interesting international presence. She was very much against, too, and still is, the idea of just having, as it were, something that's just purely Canadian. She wants to talk about architecture in a much broader way. And we tried also to deal with here Barton, Diamond and Myers, you know, the Dundas housing, to sort of get to grips with the questioning of the push for modernism, this kind of recovery of existing, you know, Christopher Alexander and so on, existing buildings, not demolishing, comparing it with Peter Dickinson's, I think, beautiful Regent's Park South building that's all now been pretty much demolished. I mean, this was the problem of a lot of modernist housing developments, of course, more around their politics, the fact that they became, in many ways, a place where you put people who had very low incomes. You didn't give them any community facilities. Of course, they became very much problem areas, alas, but I mean, a lovely bit of design. We also sort of dealt with another side of Canadian architecture, which had a very big international presence, the mega structures. Here we are at McMaster with the medical building, which is very fine. And here, looking at work by an Australian architect who worked in Canada a lot, we're looking at, gosh, I've forgotten. Is it Scarborough College? I'm having a bad moment here. But you can see how the building is in a sort of brutalist style that's following the Canadian Shield in which it's set. And then also we did try and recognize the extent to which architecture such as this very interesting building for Simon Fraser, as you know, by Arthur Erickson, what it actually involves in terms of the technology of building, you know, things around earth removal and so on, and the fact, of course, that we're back again looking at the whole issue of nature and architecture. And I won't go on too much longer. I'll just finish by saying that Canada is also very much part of the move towards a more eco-driven understanding of architecture. Admittedly, this has been demolished, alas, the ARC in PEI for the habitat of 76. But a very interesting approach, which we can sort of see coming out in the teaching of Brian McCain-Lyons, the Ghost Lab, trying to rethink vernacular architecture, making it of place, and making the learning of architecture the doing. And then, of course, too, you know, we have locally a whole series of very distinguished architects, but here the Patt Cows, with an expression of the recognition of the importance of the indigenous peoples in the schools programs that we deal with in some depth, cutaway of this building, which allowed for the participation of the local Squamish peoples. And of course, we talk about Douglas Cardinal and the marvelous contrast between the Museum of, as it is now, History, originally Civilization in Ottawa by Douglas Cardinal, and of course the example of modernity I was talking about again, the expression of the new country in 1867 being a kind of Franco-British Gothic. Here, We're seeing an architecture coming out very much of nature and the land. And in the Nicola Valley Institute of Technology, Alfred Waugh, working with Busby, the fact that we are beginning to see First Nations architects coming truly into the profession like women. And I'm having to leave out a huge amount, but it's interesting to remind you, of course, of how much of the interest of the modern movement has a parallel to the practice of Indigenous architects: mobility, use of climate, use of local materials, an understanding of architecture that is very much of the time and the place. And then almost at the end, to remind you of two very significant women, because I mentioned women, Cornelia Oberlander and Ivo Matsuzaki, who did some very good, important early work in terms of eco things. We're up in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories legislature, a lovely building, where one of the things Cornelia Oberlander did, very much still interested in the kind of thinking of people like Christopher Tannard, was to recover the existing ancient landscape. But of course, that takes us right back to the beginning and the chimeras within modernism and modernity. This is a marvelous Bertensky photograph not far from the tar sands. And of course, it gives us that whole sense of, is technology benign or not? Oh, and I wanted to go back. I want to end with this slide, because I think it's rather an interesting, and I'll let you just read it, by Pierre Trudeau, who was genuinely very interested in architecture. He had a whole series of highly significant commissions. He certainly saw architecture as being part of the, if you like, the expression of the nature of the state, as well as of social aspiration. It's a great quote. And my last slide, play with the two main languages, but try and bring in, not in any kind of tokenist way, Inuktitut, and I can't even say that word properly. But thank you very much, and I hope I didn't go over time. Now, the hope was, and I can see a number of distinguished people in the audience, was that you could both get back at me and Michelangelo, he's behind my back somewhere, or just talk about various things. I say one question that we asked ourselves all the way through, but decided not to specifically answer is, can we really identify things that are particularly Canadian? I think that two people the press approached, architects, I think the Patt Cows and also Brian McKay-Lyons, I think did do a good job of expressing what we kind of dealt with, you know, the sense of the importance of the commons in Canada, an idea of the public domain being very much part of what is architectural culture. I mean, the real interest in the problems of housing. The one difficulty that we also brought in, of course, was the way that even by 1960 there was a commission by the RAIC, the worry that the built environment was slipping away from the control of the architect and the planner. Anyway, I'll leave it open to all of you.
You know, the leaky condo crisis came out in part because of a misguided and misapplied energy policy.
Yeah.
Canada 2000, which required wrapping of plastic around residential insulation, led to the failure, et cetera. And I couldn't help but think in the last couple of weeks with the terrible news from Britain with the failure of applied insulation to modernist buildings, often for cosmetic reasons because they were brutalist.
Yeah.
You have this terrible crisis induced by taking one issue, energy or aesthetics, and not looking at the whole thing. And I think it does nothing but enforce your point of a broader and wholer view of architecture, and that all of these things matter. So well done. I have a brief question. I mean, to write a book is never easy. To write one with a collaborator half a continent away is even more difficult. Do you want to say something about co-authoring a volume like this?
Yeah, I should, given my title. Okay, so the story began. I think you were there actually, Trevor. I think it was in Alberta, at the University of Alberta that year. I talked with Michelangelo Sabatino because he has been writing a book on Ericsson for some time. And I'd done a little bit of work on Ericsson, so we were talking. And I think, I don't know, about a month later, and I get up early in the morning, so it's about, I don't know, 5:45. As we all do, because we're all kind of anxious communicators, I went to my email, and there was an email from Michelangelo saying he'd been in London. Reaction realized that it was a bit of a mistake to think that you could write the history of Canadian architecture as an add-on to that of the US, and that they were sort of interested, but we had to persuade them it was worth doing. So I did a sketch of what I thought the chapters could be, including, I said earlier we stepped aside from the idea of postmodernism and put in questioning modernism. We also made a pitch for what we call regenerative modernism, the fact that a lot of really good architects are interested in that approach to design that we associate with the modern movements, even if they can't carry forward because of the changes in politics, the social ethos. So anyway, we sent it in and they were mildly interested, and then we got together. He was then in Houston, I think, and of course we did the usual thing. We completely rewrote the scheme for the book. We started to write that, and the editor quite rightly said, no, forget it, go back to the earlier one because it's more what we want. We want a kind of a broad narrative. And so, we wrote, I must admit, I started off the process, partly because I was very interested in Reconstruction Canada and so on and so forth. But we just sort of exchanged, and we did most of it over email. And I think there were times when Michelangelo could have probably killed me, because I'm not very good at detail, and he's completely about detail. But we survived, and we still really like each other. So thank you for asking that question. Yes, please.
Two questions. First,
Yeah.
Are you selling copies of the book tonight?
I believe so, yes. The press have allowed, have said, I think, Michael, what yeah. And I think, what do they charge, what did they say we should charge? Is it 35 or 40? I don't know. 48. Oh, really? But you should give them a bit of a discount.
If you say so.
Well, no, and also there's some, it's a kind question, there are also some sheets there that you can get hold of Chicago and do that. But I think, what would you say, I think 40 is certainly fine. Then that's a discount. Yeah. And the second question.
Which is the actual question. I thought it was really interesting the way you described your reluctance to define architecture by country, in this case Canada, but that you felt it necessary based on the political framework in which it's framed.
Yeah.
And so based on your research, I'm wondering if you had any projections about where Canadian architecture is going in the coming years.
Can I express it as hopes? I think it would be marvelous if there could be a resurgence of what I think was represented by CMHC, which was an attempt to think in terms of the economic politics of the city and society, and with a strong input from government, that sense of what I describe broadly as the public domain, and the fact that architecture, I mean, there are many architects, including here in the city, who are trying to deal with the problem of accessible housing and of new approaches to housing, but it's very difficult because of the wash of money, which has such a huge impact because cities need taxation and so on and so forth. So that would be one thing. The other thing I think would be, it would be in my view, great if we had more institutional commissions that weren't sort of very much tied again to the fame culture, being very much about people and particular ideological positions. I think a resurgence of interest in, that swathe of buildings that are part of our lives, the hospital, the school, etc., etc. And also a sense that architects were more recognized in the discussion about the planning of our environment. And then add on to that, for obvious reasons, that architects take an important part in what we broadly call the sustainable development. Is that all right as an answer? Yeah, please.
Actually, I've been charged to thank you so much. But are there any other questions? No, I have one comment actually. I teach sometimes at UBC, and I had a student do a thesis on whether there was a Canadian architecture, and after 6 months she decided there wasn't. So we'll see. Anyway, thank you so much, Rhodri, for this evening, and don't forget that there are books for sale.